It was the kind of morning that felt like the beginning of something important. The sunlight poured lazily through the tall arched windows of Astoria University, catching dust particles in mid-air like slow-falling stars. The campus, an ivy-wrapped symbol of academic prestige, hummed with the energy of a new semester. Students moved between buildings with backpacks slung over shoulders, coffee cups in hand, still shaking off the summer and bracing for the intellectual storm ahead. In room 3B of the mathematics department, the air was thick with nervous energy. It was the first day of Advanced Calculus I, a course whispered about in the dorm halls like a rite of passage. The blackboard at the front bore a name in crisp white chalk: Professor Helena Miro, a legend on campus. Known for her razor-sharp intellect and zero tolerance for mediocrity, her classroom wasn't a safe haven. It was a crucible, and she intended to forge only the strongest minds. As students filed in, chatting quietly, barely anyone noticed when the door opened one last time. A man stepped in. No laptop, no flashy entrance, just dark jeans, a plain black shirt, and a worn-out notebook. His walk was calm, deliberate. A few heads turned, eyes widened, but no one said a word. It was Keanu Reeves. No camera crews, no Hollywood aura, just a quiet presence sliding into a seat at the back like he belonged there. And maybe, just maybe, he did. What no one in that room realized was that this quiet stranger was about to challenge everything they thought they knew. Not just about calculus, but about what it really means to be brilliant. The room had barely settled when the door closed with a sharp finality. Professor Helena Miro entered like a storm dressed in control. Tailored charcoal suit, posture perfect, heels tapping against the polished wood with a rhythm that silenced the last whispers in the room. She stood still for a moment, letting her presence do the talking. Then her eyes swept across the students, cold, precise, as if scanning for weakness. "Welcome to reality," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "This is advanced calculus. There's no room here for excuses, for intellectual laziness, or for empty arrogance." The message landed like a slap. Her tone made it clear. This wasn't high school anymore. This was war, and only the most disciplined minds would survive. She continued, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. "At this university, meritocracy is our compass. I don't care if your father is a billionaire or if you have 5 million followers online. What matters is what your mind can do with what you've learned, or what you're about to learn." There was a long pause. Then, suddenly but unmistakably, her eyes flicked toward the back of the room, toward Keanu Reeves. Some students shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the look. The subtext was clear. Keanu didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, notebook open, pen resting on the paper, no change in his expression, no ego, no reaction. It was the kind of silence that speaks volumes. Helena Miro wasn't just making an example, she was drawing a line in the sand, challenging the presence of a man who, to her, represented everything academia didn't need: celebrity, distraction, spectacle. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she tried to diminish had once studied differential geometry for fun, had spent late nights reading Ramanujan and Gödel while others read scripts. He wasn't pretending to be here. He was here. And as the lecture stumbled forward, an invisible current filled the room. Not from the math itself, but from a question everyone was suddenly afraid to ask out loud. What if the man in the back wasn't just an actor playing genius, but a genius who had never needed the spotlight? A few days passed, but the air in room 3B had changed. It wasn't just a class anymore. It was a quiet arena. Students came early, notebooks open, glances quick toward the back of the room where Keanu Reeves sat, as always, in silence. He had yet to say much, but somehow his silence said enough. It was the calm of someone who wasn't intimidated by difficulty, just curious about it. Professor Helena Miro entered, sharp and on time. She didn't acknowledge the atmosphere, didn't comment on the undercurrent that ran beneath her words. Instead, she launched directly into her critique of the class's diagnostic exercises. "Memorizing formulas won't save you," she said. You either understand math or you're pretending. Then her tone changed. She began pacing slowly, her words laced with something colder. We live in a time where everyone believes they have something worth saying, that quoting theories is the same as grasping them. But mathematics, she said, stopping, does not care how famous you are, how many films you've starred in, or how much the internet adores you. The implication was clear. A pause. Then, like a soft drumbeat breaking tension, a hand rose. From the back row, Keanu. The class held its breath. Yes? Miro asked, turning slowly, her face unreadable. I was just wondering, Keanu said, his voice calm but piercingly clear, why we're avoiding the actual content of the class. You said this course was about understanding math, not ideology. The silence that followed was electric. A lesser professor might have deflected, but Moreau leaned in, eyes narrowed. And what qualifies you to challenge how I conduct my class, Mr. Reeves? Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Your experience dodging bullets in slow motion? A few students chuckled nervously, but Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He just responded, no, not that. I just believe math isn't about opinion. It's a tool to describe reality, to uncover patterns we don't yet see. His tone was not arrogant but resolute. Each word felt measured, earned. For the first time, students weren't just watching him, they were listening. Even Moreau didn't interrupt. It's not about solving for X, he added. It's about understanding why X matters and what changes when you shift the frame. That did something. It cracked the glass. Students looked at one another, not because of what Keanu had said, but how he said it. It wasn't theater, it was truth, spoken without pride, without fear. Professor Moreau, for the first time in years, stood still. Truly still. Not as a lecturer, but as someone unsure, if only for a second, whether she was the smartest person in the room. And Keanu? He just lowered his hand, picked up his pen, and began writing again. No drama, just gravity. Something unspoken had shifted. By the next class, students no longer came just to pass. They came to witness. What began as another required course on the grueling road to a STEM degree was quietly becoming the most talked about room on campus. Room 3B wasn't buzzing with noise, it was humming with tension. Not the kind that pushes people away, but the kind that draws them in, like static before a storm. At the center of that quiet storm, Keanu Reeves. He entered as he always did, unannounced, unrushed, unnoticed by anyone who didn't know better. Same black shirt, same notebook worn soft at the edges. He took his usual seat at the back like it was a ritual, not a performance. But the stares were different now. This wasn't celebrity curiosity anymore. It was something rarer, deeper, intellectual respect. They had seen what he was capable of, not just solving problems, but making people feel what numbers meant. And when Professor Helena Miro walked in moments later, her heels ticking sharper than usual against the hardwood, the class instinctively tensed. She didn't greet them. She went straight to the board and, without a word, began to write. Not sentences, not formulas, an equation, monstrous, complicated, unfamiliar. It snaked across the entire board like a wall of code from another dimension. Students exchanged glances, flipping pages, blinking hard. This wasn't from the textbook. This, she said, turning, is what separates real mathematicians from enthusiasts. It's not in your syllabus, not in your prep guides, and not meant to be solved unless you belong here. Her eyes locked on Keanu. No one volunteered. The room was breathless. A trap had been set. And Keanu? He didn't look up right away. He took a moment, studied the board. Then, in the stillness, he quietly closed his notebook and stood. A rustle of surprise swept the room like wind through dry leaves. He walked forward, not with swagger but with purpose, like someone walking into a place they've always known but never claimed. He stood in front of the board and didn't touch the chalk at first. he just read. Even Professor Moreau stepped back. Keanu finally picked up a piece of chalk, turning it gently in his fingers the way a musician might hold a pick or a surgeon a scalpel. And then he began. But he didn't dive in where the problem screamed for attention. He began at the edge where the structure frayed, and slowly, like unraveling a knot, he spoke. "This looks like a nested limit problem, layered with a topological twist," he said softly, voice low but clear. "But there's a contradiction hidden in the middle. If we isolate this component and treat it not as a value but as a behavior, it shifts." And with that, he began writing, line by line, calm, clear, purposeful. He referenced Euler, Ramanujan, Noether, not for show but because their logic lived in the bones of this problem. He drew small arrows, circled patterns, even sketched a dimensional shift in the margins. The class leaned in. Professor Moreau, arms still crossed, didn't stop him. She couldn't, because the impossible was happening, not just the solution but the transformation of a classroom, of understanding, of how brilliance looks when it doesn't need to prove itself. And when Keanu finished, stepping away from the board, he didn't smile. He simply turned, handed the chalk back to the professor, and returned to his seat like it was just another day. But for everyone in that room, nothing would ever be the same. By the time the next class rolled around, room 3B felt different, not just tense, charged, like the air before thunder. Word had spread beyond the math department. Something unusual was happening, and it wasn't just about calculus anymore. Students arrived early, again, not out of obligation but out of quiet anticipation. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. The class had become something else, something alive. Keanu Reeves entered a few minutes before the hour, same as always, calm, unassuming. He took his seat in the back, placed his notebook gently on the desk and looked ahead, eyes steady. He wasn't looking to be noticed, but by now he always was. Professor Helena Moreau was already there, standing by the board, arms crossed. Her posture hadn't changed, but something in her expression had. She looked tight, composed, but barely. She didn't say hello, didn't welcome anyone. Instead, she turned and filled the blackboard with another complex equation, long, abstract, unyielding. Then she stopped, chalk in hand, and faced the room. "Mr. Reeves," she said, voice clipped and deliberate, "you seem to enjoy being the center of attention." Silence fell like glass shattering. Keanu blinked once, then met her gaze. "I'm just here to help," he said, softly. "No ego, just truth." She took a step forward, her voice sharper now. "You're not faculty, you're not even officially enrolled in this course, so why are you really here?" The question wasn't academic, it was personal. A challenge disguised as protocol, the subtext clear. This is my space, not yours. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He stood slowly, like a man choosing words with care. "Because I love math," he said, "and because I believe anyone can understand it if someone's willing to teach it in a way they can see." That sentence didn't just answer the question, it revealed a wound in the system, in the structure, in everything this classroom had become. And some of the students, whether they realized it or not, felt it too. But Professor Moreau wasn't ready to let go of the chalk just yet. "Or maybe," she said, voice colder now, "this is just your new stage, a role you're playing, the genius among the commoners." The room tensed, but Keanu didn't react with anger, no sarcasm, no defense. He simply said, "You challenged me in front of everyone," I responded, and people understood. Isn't that the point of teaching? A few students looked down, others looked at her. The silence stretched. Then the door opened. In walked Dean Richard Lane, calm, composed, curious. "I heard this class has become dynamic," he said with a small smile. "Mind if I watch?" Moreau gave a stiff nod, but her jaw tightened. The lesson resumed, technically, but no one was truly listening. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Midway through, Keanu raised his hand. Would you allow me to present a second method for this problem, side by side with yours, not to compete, just to clarify? The proposal was humble, fair, even generous. But it was also an invitation: co-teach or conceal. Professor Moreau froze. Then, tight-lipped, she answered, "No, this is my class. I don't share my board with outsiders." The disappointment was audible, not loud but present, in a wave of quiet shifting, sighs, downturned eyes. Keanu took a breath. Not confrontational, compassionate. "With respect, Professor, you challenged me in front of this room, but now you're walking away from that same challenge." Her eyes flared. "Are you accusing me of cowardice?" He shook his head gently. "No, I'm saying how we lead is how we're remembered." The room stopped breathing. The dean stood still, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Every student in that room knew this was the moment everything would turn or break. Professor Moreau's hand gripped the chalk like a weapon, her breath shallow, her mind a storm. Then, finally, her voice cracked the silence. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling just enough for truth to leak through. "I won't be humiliated in my own classroom." And then Keanu walked forward. Not proud, not angry, just steady. "No one's trying to humiliate you," he said gently. "We just want to learn." She stared at him, eyes still burning, but beneath the flame was something else. Fear. He extended his hand, and after a pause so long it could have broken, she handed him the chalk. The chalk sat in Keanu Reeves' hand like it had always belonged there. Not as a weapon, not as a symbol of authority, but as a bridge. The classroom held its breath. He turned to the board slowly, eyes scanning the equations that still glared down at the class like unsolved riddles. But instead of charging in, Keanu took a moment, a long, deliberate pause, not for drama but for presence, for connection. Then he spoke. "Let's look at this problem not as a wall but as a shape, something that moves, something that lives." He picked up a different piece of chalk, yellow, and began underlining certain terms, then drew arrows, diagrams, flow lines. Instead of reducing the equation to steps and symbols, he turned it into motion, into intuition. "Imagine this like a leaf falling," he said softly, "or a hill slope guiding water. The math isn't just numbers, it's the path something would take if it was allowed to move freely." One student leaned in, eyes wide. Another started taking notes again, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to remember this. They didn't just see the logic now, they saw the beauty. Behind Keanu, Professor Helena Moreau stood still. Her arms were no longer crossed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, they watched everything. Keanu continued, walking them through the same problem she had written, but from a different direction. He used colors, sketched real-world analogies, described pressure systems, gradients, gravity. He didn't simplify the math, he illuminated it. And as he reached the final steps, solving the seemingly impossible equation with clarity and grace, a ripple moved through the classroom, a silence heavy with understanding, the kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from revelation. Then came the first clap. Tentative, from the front row, then another, then more, and suddenly the room erupted, not with polite applause but with genuine, rising appreciation. Some students stood, a few had tears in their eyes, not because they understood everything perfectly, but because, for the first time, they felt like they could. Keanu didn't bow, he didn't beam, he simply turned to Professor Moreau and handed her the chalk back. She took it without a word. Her fingers closed around it, but she didn't move toward the board. Instead, she stood frozen, staring not at the map, but at the space Keanu had just created. And in that space, something shifted. The ego, the control, the need to be the smartest voice in the room, it cracked. Not shattered, just enough for humility to seep in. She looked at the students, truly looked at them, and saw not passive bodies, but minds that had just come alive. And without a word, she turned and slowly erased the board. Not in anger, not to erase his work, but like clearing the stage for something new. The chalk dust fell like ashes, soft and symbolic, a quiet surrender, not of dignity, but of pride. As the class began to gather their things, no one rushed. They lingered like something sacred had just happened, and walking away felt wrong. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Do you tutor?" a student asked Keanu almost nervously. A girl from the middle row, usually silent. He blinked, surprised, then smiled. Small, gentle. "I stay after class," he said. "Anyone who wants help is welcome." A few more students hovered nearby. One pulled their chair closer. Another didn't even ask. They just sat down and opened their notebook. And suddenly, a circle formed. Not around a celebrity, but around someone who saw them, who didn't talk down, but lifted them up. From the doorway, Dean Richard Lane stood watching. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, the kind of nod reserved for moments you knew would become legend. And Professor Moreau? She watched too. But this time, she didn't feel threatened. She felt relieved. Because for the first time in a long while, the classroom wasn't about control. It was about learning, about seeing the subject not as a fortress to defend, but as a garden to grow in. And it took someone who had every reason to claim the spotlight, to show that real power lies in sharing it. That day would become a marker, a moment students would talk about for years, not because a famous man taught them math, but because he reminded them that intelligence isn't about domination. It's about invitation. And understanding, real, human, messy, beautiful understanding, doesn't begin with formulas. It begins with listening. Room 3B wasn't just a classroom anymore. It had become something else entirely. A quiet revolution tucked inside the stone walls of Astoria University. Word had spread far beyond the mathematics department. Students who weren't even enrolled began slipping in, sitting cross-legged on the floor, lining the back wall, hoping to witness what everyone had started calling the shift. At the center of it all was Keanu Reeves, still seated at the back like he always had been. No fanfare, no entourage, just the same black notebook, same calm posture, same steady eyes, watching, listening, ready to help. What had begun as a single act of humility, solving a complex equation not to prove superiority but to illuminate understanding, had sparked something no one anticipated. Students felt seen, capable, invited. The fear of failure began to erode, replaced not with arrogance but curiosity. And Professor Helena Miro, something in her had changed too. She still walked into the room with precision, her presence commanding, but it no longer came from rigidity, it came from purpose. She no longer viewed the chalkboard as her battleground, but as a shared space, a canvas where theory and clarity could coexist. One morning, she paused before class began. "I made mistakes," she said softly, her voice steadier than ever. "I let pride speak louder than my purpose. I forgot that a classroom is not a fortress, but a bridge." Eyes turned toward the back, where Keanu sat. He didn't move, but a quiet smile touched the corner of his lips. "Mr. Reeves," she continued, "I want to thank you, and if you're willing, would you consider co-teaching future sessions with me? I believe your clarity complements the theory we explore here." The room went still, not out of shock, but out of something more powerful, respect. Keanu stood slowly, no performance, just presence. "Only if we do it together," he said, "not teacher and guest, just two people who love helping others understand." From that day on, everything shifted. Professor Miro taught the core concepts, guiding the theory with her sharpened brilliance. And Keanu? He wove the connective tissue, metaphors, visualizations, real-world parallels that turned abstraction into insight. It wasn't a lecture anymore. It was a conversation. Grades began to rise, but more importantly, questions did too. Students spoke up. They stayed after class. They debated, they explored, they dreamed in numbers. Not because they had to, but because someone had unlocked the door and said, "Come in, you belong here." The university took notice. Other departments began rethinking their approach. Collaborative teaching models emerged. Theory was still valued, but so was understanding, so was accessibility. And Keanu? He never moved from the back row. He never joined the faculty. He never asked for credit. He simply showed up. Every class, notebook in hand. When someone looked lost, he leaned in, offered a thought, a metaphor, a quiet, "Try it this way." One afternoon, a freshman lingered after class. She had stayed silent all semester, but today something in her had changed. "Why do you sit back there?" she asked. Keanu looked at her, really looked, and then smiled. "Because from the back," he said gently, "you can see who needs help the most." It was never about being the smartest. It was never about proving anything. It was about building a space where brilliance wasn't intimidating, it was shared. A place where learning wasn't about performing, it was about connecting. Where education wasn't a spotlight, it was a torch, passed hand to hand. And as students filtered out of room 3B, chattering, comparing notes, exchanging ideas, one thing was clear. The real privilege isn't knowing more than others. It's using what you know so that everyone can rise. True privilege isn't about knowing more than others. It's about using what you know to help others rise.